listeners. Welcome to Grief Out Loud. Remember the last time you tried to talk about grief and suddenly everybody left the room? Grief Out Loud is opening up this often avoided conversation because grief is hard enough without having to go through it alone. We bring you a mix of personal stories, tips for supporting children, teens, and yourself, and interviews with professionals in the grief world. Platitude and cliche-free, we promise. Grief Out Loud is hosted by me, Jana DeCristofaro, and produced by the Dougy Center for Grieving Children and Families in Portland, Oregon. Jenny Delacruz is an author and a therapist, and she's also a mother. Recently, she found herself in a situation that is becoming familiar to so many parents and caregivers. In the middle of the night, her youngest son came to her in a swirl of big emotions related to the COVID-19 pandemic. He was frustrated and confused and sad and scared. He missed seeing his friends and family. He wanted to know, when would it be over? He needed reassurance and information about the parts of the situation that were scary and unknown. He eventually went back to sleep, but Jenny was left, as so many parents and caregivers are, with the residue of those intense emotions and questions. So rather than try to will herself back to sleep, Jenny turned to words and sketched out what would become her newest children's book. Momma, Can I Sleep With You Tonight? Jenny and I delve into what inspired her to pursue psychology and therapy as a career, and how that led to her becoming a children's book author. We also discuss how she's seeing grief show up with her clients, related to COVID-19, related to the media coverage of the murders of Black people, often at the hands of police, and also the ongoing traumatic effects of racism and racist violence. Jenny provides some easy-to-implement strategies to support children, and adults too, in processing the grief and other emotions connected to these events. Jenny, thank you so much for joining me for Grief Out Loud today.
Jana, thank you for giving me this space.
Well, I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And before we kind of go into some of the details about the books that you've authored and the work that you do, tell us a little bit about your work and what drew you to being a therapist.
Sure. To be honest with you, as a child, I was always drawn to the helping professions, whether it's a teacher, a social worker, police officer, you name it. And, as a first generation American, my parents are actually from Haiti, by the way, I was encouraged to become either a lawyer or a doctor. But I remember a psychology class was offered in my senior year in high school. And it was at that moment I had an aha, and I knew that this was the direction I needed to take. I was concerned about how the unseen nature of mental health is so powerful enough that it can change the course of our lives. And I was intrigued by that as well.
How did that conversation go with your family when you decided, maybe not so much doctor, lawyer, engineer, I'm interested in working in psychology?
Yeah, I think it was a time where the adulting began, setting up those boundaries and saying this is the life that I need to go. And eventually they supported me, but at first, there was definitely some pushback, for sure.
A great experience in supporting your clients and having to set those boundaries as well.
Absolutely.
And then throughout the course of your career working as a therapist, you also uncovered another talent and interest, which is writing children's books. And what kind of inspired you to start that avenue of your work?
Yeah, the funny part about that is that my children actually inspired me to write. My first book, Fridays with Miss Melange Haiti, was really birthed out of frustration because I wanted to teach my 6-year-old son about the history of Haiti, but could not find a book to do that in a level where he would understand. And so, I did research. I looked at all the libraries on Amazon, and my husband said, "Why don't you write it?" And so at first I was like, well, I'll just, make something for the house. It's almost like you have your t-shirt that you only wear in the house, the party seats. But then, Jana, I've started to put so much work into it, so much research into it. I really had this conviction that I had to really share this with others. And I was very intentional about making sure that this book not only taught about history, but it promoted emotional intelligence and critical thinking skills.
Mm.
And so that was really my goal. And the funny thing about that, that was my oldest son that inspired me to write my first book. And then my youngest son inspired me to write my second book, which is called Momma, Can I Sleep With You Tonight? And on April 5th, he woke me up at 3 a.m. to talk about his real big fears and big feelings surrounded COVID-19. And of course, he goes and fall right back asleep. And I was up. I was up and I had, Jana, all these ideas. It just came racing in my head. And I did what I always tell my clients not to do. Do not pick up your phone when you're trying to go to sleep. I picked up my phone and I couldn't stop writing. And when the sun came up, the draft was done. I shared it with my husband and he said, wow, that hit me like a ton of bricks because he said every emotion that you expressed here was, I remember going to work one day and feeling all those feelings all at once.
Yeah, and that seems to be the power of children's books. Like they're written with children in mind, and then as adults we read them and we're like, yeah, me too, exactly. Thank you for speaking to my story. Thank you for highlighting the swirl of emotions that are coming with the COVID-19 pandemic and my fears. And the part in the book that I love is when the mom and the son, which I'm assuming are you and your son, are talking about the things that he can do because he's talking about all the things that he can't do. And I just was really struck by that idea of like creating some sense of agency, even within all the limitations of what's happening in the world right now.
Yes, it's so important, to find hope because it's hard to feel stuck in that feeling of hopelessness.
Yeah, and that hopelessness is also something that shows up so much for people in dealing with grief. And I'm curious, like, what do you have a sense of how your personal experience with grief informs your writing and also the work that you do as a therapist?
Absolutely. I remember my personal experience was losing my grandparents, and I lost as a young adult before my kids were actually born when I was first married. And this was very significant for me because I pretty much remember living with my grandmother the first 5 years of my life, and my first language was Haitian Creole. And so that was very foundational for me. And so that was huge. And then of course, as a counselor, walking through the grief my clients were experiencing in my practice helped me, especially in the latest book, dealing with the impact of COVID-19, because in the story, I was able to break down the stages of grief in a way a child could understand. And as you mentioned earlier, this book can also help parents cope because we also deal with these major changes of grief. And and I'm sure you've heard of the many stages. You probably haven't memorized, but we focus on the first five: denial, anger, sadness, bargaining, and acceptance. But I also believe that we should also include a sixth stage, which is transformation. And that's something that I didn't include in my book, but think is also very important. My good friend Charissa reminded me of that.
Yeah, and the stages with grief is it's always such a tricky concept in that a lot of those experiences are really valid for people. The feeling super angry, the wondering how can I like is there some way that I can make a bargain to change something about this or just that fighting against like this can't be true, this can't be true. And then just overwhelming sadness and how those can be really valid touchstones for a lot of people in their grief. And then also recognizing that they don't unfold in any sort of like neat manner, right? Like we don't get to just like, ooh, check this one off. Now we move into the next one and we never circle back around. And so I love the idea of that transformation because that seems to encompass the way that people move in and out and all around the various expressions of grief, including the emotions and the thoughts and the physical sensations that come with it as well.
Absolutely.
Do you have a sense of like the way grief is showing up for children in particular? I'm thinking about so related to COVID-19, because we focus so much, especially in Grief Out Loud and at the Ducky Center, on children who've experienced the death or the diagnosis of a parent or a caregiver or sibling, some other important person in their life. And then we think about the idea that grief can show up through any type of change or loss. And thinking about COVID-19, thinking about the protests that are happening right now against police brutality and really highlighting, exposing the systemic racism that's been around forever, but is really in people's forefront of their minds right now. Well, I should say more in the forefront of white people, as it's been in the forefront of the minds of the Black community forever. But it's coming into a new way of being talked about. It's so public. And I just wonder, like, are you seeing, how's that showing up for kids in your practice? That was a really long way to get to my question.
I appreciate you asking that, though. I think that for children, as you mentioned, they're experiencing the loss of normalcy of their lives. Kids, they're aware of what's going on, even as adults try to hide it. They realize, okay, my mom or dad, they're not going to work like they used to. My schedule is drastically changed. Not only am I not going to school, but for kids who had the extracurricular activities, they really are feeling the difference. And I believe many Black children are triggered when they see folks on their screen who looks just like them dying an unjust death. And I do want to give a moment of silence to the family and friends of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and most recently, Rayshard Brooks. And there's countless of other lives who experienced loss. That loss was not televised and never got justice. I do want to say, Jana, that in addition to grief, it gets complicated, right? Because this grief is also mixed in with post-traumatic stress. I had a client whose husband had very similar features to George Floyd. So can you imagine not only her, but her children, how afraid when the states opened up again and he had to go to work? They were so afraid for him. And I think that is very traumatizing to worry, is my dad gonna return back from work because he looks just like George Floyd? I think that can be very devastating. And I would say that, it's really important not only for us as community members to be aware of this, but, for even teachers and educators to be prepared. And I'm actually in the process of writing a guide called How Was Your Summer, to support a quick guide for teachers to find resources on emotional support for students that will be entering back to these schools.
Yeah, given that the answer to the how was your summer question is going to be so different and so complex compared to perhaps just even the fall of 2019.
Yes.
In talking about your client, that's something I hadn't thought about in terms of, her husband looking so similar to George Floyd, and then to see George Floyd's photo and on the news, and that in a sense almost seeing a repeated version of his death over and over and over again, and to see someone who looks like daddy
Yeah.
in that way. And how did you support that client in supporting her children?
Yeah. And in that situation, the best thing that I could do, to be honest with you, was to keep my mouth shut. You know, sometimes, we learn all these techniques in these colleges, and it's like, yeah, there's a time and place for everything. But I do believe just sitting in someone's grief is powerful and can provide such healing because you allow that individual to have a voice, to own their voice. And you're saying that your voice is important to me to the point where I'm going to put my techniques aside to join you in your grief. And, there were times where I cried with them.
Yeah, just to be there, to be a presence, to be a witness, to create that space and that opportunity to give words to something that so often goes beyond words. And it can be so hard to find the time and the space to even construct a narrative about what's happening.
Just being present is words can't describe its power. And I would encourage families to just be present to like when their kids are on the floor playing, even if it's just for 5 minutes, get down on the floor, get down on their level and talk to them. It makes a huge difference, versus, we're yelling at them from the kitchen because they see us as giants. We're towering over them. But when we get down on the floor and we're playing with them and engaging them, they're like, wow, like you really see me.
And I think too with kids, they have such a unique way of expressing and making sense of grief and loss. And I know for me in my role, I learned so much more from them than they are ever going to learn from me about grief and loss and what's helpful. And I'm curious from your vantage point of working directly with children in this way, what's your sense of how they make sense of loss and of grief?
Well, I find it really differs from child to child, but I find that kids, for the most part, the ones that I have worked with, I'll give you an example. They've viewed Corona as like almost like a monster, right? This invisible monster. I had one child who, in play therapy, got all these objects to put around the mouths and noses of all the people. And it was just like, okay, everyone's mask is on. I'm gonna open the door and then 1, 2, 3, run, Corona, and just running,
Mm.
and I feel like they're picking up from us because they see when we're at the grocery stores, perhaps the panic, people are not really greeting each other. They're quickly in and out, they're very can be short with one another. And I think kids, they pick up on things. If anything, they're showing us how we're dealing with it. And so it could be a litmus test for us. But I find that children, they really conceptualize these ideas well through play, through art, and through writing. And so that's a great way to get their thoughts and feelings out for, anyone who really wants to check in.
Yeah, I love the idea of offering those creative opportunities for expression, like you mentioned, of writing or drawing or even through their play. Are there some other kind of tangible suggestions or tips you would give to parents and caregivers who are supporting kids through the kind of maelstrom of emotions that are coming with COVID-19 and with the protests and everything else that's happening in the context of our world right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say it's so important for kids to be able to release any anger, frustration, or anxiety physically because it does get stored up in their bodies. That's why you may see a child all of the sudden having mood swings and you're saying, "Hey, what's going on?" Not realizing in one day they can be going through a little bit of shock, a little bit of anger, and then sadness. So one activity that I love is just getting like a bowl of rice or sand or whatever, small pebbles, and having a child just squeeze those items. It's a sensory activity that really helps them to release the tension from their bodies And it also helps to calm their central nervous system. Another great technique is if a child's really frustrated or angry, tell them to go up to their room and punch their pillow. A lot of times we shame children or even ourselves for being angry. Oh, you shouldn't be angry. No, there's nothing wrong with being angry. In fact, it's all about how you express it. And so it might be a win-win for some parents. They're punching their pillow so much they fall asleep, you get a break. So, and honestly, Jana, we needed too as parents. I remember, homeschooling my kids. I had my stress ball right there, with me, by my side. And honestly, exercising really does help me to sleep better. And I do believe it's related to that tension leaving the body.
And what a great reminder, whenever I might talk with a guest about like what are some concrete tips you have for parents and caregivers. And the first one really is like, how are you tending to your own emotional state? And what are you doing to care for yourself so that you're a little more regulated to be present? As we talked about that power of presence with your kids and the ways that they're making their way through all those emotions. And now you've got me thinking about a bowl of pebbles that I'm definitely going to keep near my desk and also provide to my partner. So,
Absolutely awesome. I love it.
speaking of attending to ourselves, what's helping you and your family? I know you have two younger children and you and your husband, like what's helping you all these days?
To be honest with you, having a connection with our community really helps us. For instance, we're part of a community group at our church, and they have this phone tree set up so that you only check on one person a week. And so at the end of the week, everyone has been checked upon, right? And I feel like grief, anxiety, depression, and I believe that these issues can worsen when we are isolated and without support. I also like to do journaling myself, to be honest with you. And there is a free journaling app that I like to go to that uses the cognitive behavioral therapy model, and it's called CBT Thought Diary. And so that's my go-to. And I like how anytime you enter like a really negative or really if you're really down, it gives you a checklist. And so you get to start to see your patterns and what your triggers may be. And I think that self-awareness is so crucial. It's so crucial.
Well, Jenny, I've really appreciated this conversation and being able to hear a little bit about your work and about your two books that are available. And also, do you have a YouTube channel? Is that true?
Yes. My YouTube channel is called Storytime with Miss Melange. And in that channel, I read books that celebrates diverse characters. And after each story, I like to end with a question to promote critical thinking skills.
That sounds like a great resource for parents and caregivers to kind of roll into some of the suggestions and tips that you've already provided. So, listeners, I will link in the show notes to the YouTube channel and to both of the books, including Jenny's latest, The Mama, Can I Sleep With You Tonight, which is specifically around supporting kids around COVID-19. Jenny, is there any other way that listeners should connect with you?
Yes, you can connect with me on Instagram at Storytime Melange. And I'm also on Facebook at Diverse Kids Books. Lastly, I do provide virtual counseling for individuals and families. And I recently started a Black therapy support group, which has been really helpful in allowing Black women to process their own experiences with systematic racism and what they have been exposed to in our media. And so, if anyone's interested in any therapy, you can go to restorative therapy info. And Jana, I'm really trying to break that stigma, against mental health. And I'm always the first to say that as a licensed therapist, I also get therapy.
So, listeners, some really great resources available through Jenny, both for yourself as adults needing specific therapy, but also the books, the story time, lots of resources to help support your kids and your teens during this time. So, Jenny, thank you again for being part of Grief Out Loud today. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Oh, Jana, I enjoyed my time as well. And thank you so much for having me.
And listeners out there, if you are new to our show, you can find all of our past episodes at our website, dougy.org. And if you are someone who's listening and you're like, gosh, here's a topic I really wish you all would talk about, or here's someone I think you should interview, or you just want to share what the show means to you, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at griefoutloud@dougy.org. So thanks so much for listening, and we hope you'll join us again next time.